A mountain man sees a homeless Amish girl teaching his daughter, and what he did next shocked the entire town. The cabin door creaks open. A rough hand grips a rifle. A barefoot girl whispers scripture by lamplight as a child listens wide-eyed. He only meant to check his traps that night. Instead, he found a stranger teaching the one thing he could not give: hope. Hooves thunder. Men shout outside the cabin. A preacher's voice cuts sharp. "Cast her out or bring shame on us all." But the girl held more than lessons. She carried secrets of faith, petitions, and a fight against men who wanted his land. The crack of fists on wood. The girl dragged screaming into the snow. The father falls to his knees, whispering a prayer he thought he'd forgotten. In a town ruled by rumor and the railroad, will a broken family's courage be enough to save her? Or will the frontier swallow them whole? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Francis Rourke's boots crunched through the crusty snow as he made his way home through the gathering dusk. The setting sun painted the Colorado highlands in deep purples and blues, while his breath clouded before him in the bitter cold. His trapline had yielded 2 rabbits and a fox, enough to make it worth the trek, but his fingers had gone numb hours ago. The familiar sight of smoke curling from his cabin's chimney brought a tired smile to his weathered face. Clara would have kept the fire stoked, just as he'd taught her. His 9-year-old daughter had grown capable beyond her years since her mother's passing, though it pained him to see her childhood shortened by necessity. As he approached the cabin, something unusual caught his ear. A soft voice carried through the walls, rising and falling in a gentle rhythm he didn't recognize. Francis froze, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung across his back. They had no close neighbors, and visitors were rare in these high mountains, especially with winter settling in. He crept closer, boots silent now in the deep snow. The voice continued, measured and calm, accompanied by Clara's higher pitch sounding out words carefully. Reading. His daughter was reading? Francis eased the cabin door open, hinges creaking in the cold. The scene before him stopped him dead in his tracks. Clara sat cross-legged by the hearth, firelight dancing across her face as she bent over what looked like a horn book. Beside her sat a thin girl he'd never seen before, dressed in the plain, dark clothes of the Amish, her feet bare despite the cold. Both girls startled at his entrance, Clara's eyes going wide while the stranger scrambled to her feet, nearly stumbling in her haste. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, with a face that spoke of recent hardship despite its youth. "Pa!" Clara called out, jumping up to greet him. "This is Miriam. She's been teaching me my letters proper." Francis's jaw tightened as he studied the unexpected guest. "That so?" he said slowly, keeping his voice level for Clara's sake. "And how exactly did Miriam come to be in our cabin?" The Amish girl, Miriam, twisted her hands in her simple dress. "I meant no harm, sir," she said softly, her voice carrying the lilt of Pennsylvania Dutch. "I only wanted to warm myself a spell, and when your daughter found me—" She glanced at Clara with obvious affection. "She was trying so hard with her hornbook, I couldn't help but offer guidance." "She knows all kinds of words, Pa," Clara cut in eagerly. "She showed me how the letters make different sounds when you put them together. I can almost read a whole page now." Francis set his rifle carefully in its usual corner, buying time to think. The girl was clearly no threat. Her trembling wasn't entirely from cold, but he'd learned the hard way that kindness could mask darker intentions. Still, Clara's excitement was hard to ignore. His daughter had been so lonely since her mother died, with no one but him for company. "Where are your people?" he asked Miriam directly. "Ain't no Amish settlements I know of up this high." Miriam's eyes dropped to the rough-hewn floorboards. "I left my uncle's farm near Denver 3 days ago, sir." She swallowed hard. "He wasn't a kind man. My parents are gone, and I had nowhere else to turn." Clara moved to stand beside Miriam, small hand slipping into the older girl's. Please, can she stay, Pa? Just for tonight? It's so cold outside. Francis rubbed his beard, studying the pair of them. Clara's hopeful face. Miriam's quiet dignity despite her obvious fear. The snow was getting deeper by the hour, and the temperature would drop well below freezing once night fully fell. "Reckon you can stay for supper at least," he said finally. "Clara, help me clean these rabbits and we'll have a proper meal." Relief flooded Miriam's face. "Thank you, sir." "I can help. I know how to dress game." Francis shook his head. "You've done enough teaching for one day. Just rest by the fire." As he and Clara worked outside in the failing light, his daughter chattered about all she'd learned that afternoon. Francis listened with mixed feelings. Reading had never been his strong suit. He could manage basic words when he had to, but anything more complex left him frustrated. Clara's mother had started teaching her, but since her passing, those lessons had fallen by the wayside. Back inside, the rabbit stew filled the cabin with savory aromas. Francis watched as Miriam showed Clara how to hold her spoon properly, something he'd never thought to teach, and answered the child's endless questions about books and writing with patient grace. As the evening wore on, Clara's excitement gradually gave way to sleepiness. She ended up dozing against Miriam's shoulder, the hornbook still clutched in her small hands. The sight stirred something in Francis's chest. Memory, longing, worry all mixed together. He banked the fire for the night, movements practiced and automatic as his mind worked. Finally, he turned to Miriam, who was still sitting perfectly straight, despite Clara's weight against her. "There's rules if you're staying," he said quietly, not wanting to wake his daughter. "First light, we need to know your full story. No hiding anything. You'll earn your keep if you remain here, and there'll be no sneaking off without word." Miriam nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir, I understand." "I ain't decided yet if you can stay past tomorrow," he continued, "but I reckon we can sort that out in the morning." "Thank you, Mr. Rourke, for everything." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the gratitude in it was genuine. Francis gently lifted Clara, who stirred only slightly as he carried her to her bed in the corner. When he returned, Miriam had already spread her shawl on the floor near the hearth. "There's extra blankets in the chest," he said gruffly, pointing. "Night gets mighty cold up here." He settled into his own bed, positioned where he could see both the door and the fire. The cabin fell into silence, broken only by the occasional pop of burning wood and Clara's soft breathing. Francis stayed awake for a long time, watching the stranger's silhouette by the dying fire, wondering if he was doing right by his daughter or making a terrible mistake. Morning would tell, he supposed. Morning would tell. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the frost-covered windows with pale golden light. Francis woke to the familiar sound of Clara stirring the fire back to life. But there was something different this morning. The quiet murmur of another voice, soft and gentle, guiding his daughter's movements. He sat up, memories of the previous evening flooding back. The Amish girl, Miriam, was already up and dressed, her plain dark dress neat despite having slept on the floor. She stood at Clara's side, showing her how to position the kindling just so. "Morning, Pa," Clara called out cheerfully. "Miriam showed me how to stack the wood better. See how the flame catches quicker?" Francis nodded, pulling on his boots. "That's fine, Clara. But the wood pile's running low. Best I get to chopping before the day gets ahead of us." Outside, the morning air bit sharp and clean. Francis hefted his axe, the familiar weight settling into his palms as he set to work. The rhythmic thunk of steel against wood helped clear his head, but he couldn't help glancing toward the cabin every few strikes. Through the window, he watched Clara and Miriam moving about their morning tasks. The girl had found Clara's torn mittens and sat mending them with neat, practiced stitches while his daughter gathered her water bucket. When Clara headed toward the creek, Miriam quickly set aside her sewing to follow. "Let me help you with that," Miriam's voice carried on the crisp air. "The rocks might be slippery with frost." Francis paused in his chopping, axe held mid-swing. He'd taught Clara to be careful at the creek, but another set of watchful eyes didn't hurt. The two returned shortly, Clara chattering away while Miriam steadied the heavy bucket between them. Once the morning chores were done, Francis knew it was time for answers. He called Miriam to join him at the rough-hewn table while Clara fed scraps to the chickens outside. "Reckon it's time you told me the full story," he said, keeping his voice level. "Where'd you come from? And what brought you up this far into the mountains?" Miriam's hands folded in her lap, knuckles white with tension. "My parents and I were traveling from our community in Pennsylvania to join family in Oregon Territory. But 3 months ago, our wagon—" Her voice caught. "There was an accident, a steep grade, a broken wheel. I was gathering berries when it happened. They were both gone before I could reach them." Francis studied her face, seeing no deception there. Only old pain, carefully contained. "The nearest settlement was Denver," she continued. "My uncle, my father's brother, had a farm there. He took me in, but—" Miriam's eyes dropped to her hands. He was not a godly man despite his plain dress. He spoke of arranging a marriage to a man 3 times my age, one who'd offered him a good price. When I refused. She touched her arm briefly, an unconscious gesture that spoke volumes. "So you ran," Francis finished for her. "Yes, sir. I know it wasn't right to enter your home uninvited, but when I saw the cabin through the trees, I was so cold. I only meant to warm myself a little while you were away. Then Clara found me, and she was so eager to learn." The door creaked open as Clara bounded back inside, cheeks red from the cold. "Pa, can Miriam stay?" "Please. She knows so many things, about reading and sewing and cooking and—" "Clara," Francis cut her off gently. "Give us a minute more to talk." His daughter's face fell, but she nodded and retreated to her corner with her hornbook. Francis turned back to Miriam. "Your uncle? He likely to come looking?" "I don't think so," Miriam said quietly. "He cares more for his reputation than finding me. But if word spreads that I'm here—" Francis nodded grimly. He'd have to ride into town soon anyway. They needed supplies, and it was best to know what rumors might be stirring. Better to face them head-on than be caught unawares. "Clara," he called, "get your coat on. We're heading to town." While Clara scrambled to get ready, Francis turned to Miriam. "You'll stay here. Keep the door barred. I need to know if sheltering you is like to bring trouble down on my girl." "I understand, sir." Miriam's voice was steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "I'll tend things here, if you'll allow it." By noon, Francis had harnessed the mule to their small wagon, and he and Clara set out for town. The road wound down through the pines, patches of early winter snow making the going slow. Clara filled the journey with chatter about all the words Miriam had shown her, pointing out signs she could, now read as they approached the settlement. The general store's bell jangled as they entered. Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, gave them her usual friendly greeting. But Francis noticed how her eyes lingered on Clara, questions clearly burning behind her smile. As he gathered their supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and ammunition, he caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Strange girl up at Rourke's cabin, and plain dress, like them Amish folk, and all alone with his daughter." He kept his face neutral, though his jaw clenched tight. Clara, absorbed in examining a shelf of penny candies, seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of gossip. Francis added a small paper of peppermint drops to their purchases, a peace offering of sorts for leaving Miriam alone all day. The sun was setting by the time they made it back up the mountain. Warm light spilled from the cabin windows, and when Francis pushed open the door, the smell of baking bread and simmering beans filled the air. Miriam stood at the hearth, stirring a pot with quiet confidence. The cabin floor had been swept, fresh water waited in the barrel, and even the windows looked clearer than they had in months. "Welcome home!" Clara rushed to inspect Miriam's cooking. "Oh, it smells so good! Pa, look what Miriam made with just beans and that old bread starter." "Much obliged," Francis said gruffly, setting down their supplies. "Wasn't expecting such a welcome." "It's the least I can do," Miriam replied softly. "Clara helped me find everything in the root cellar." After they'd eaten, the simple meal tasting better than anything Francis had managed in recent memory, Clara proudly showed him her progress with reading. She sounded out words carefully, Miriam offering gentle corrections when needed. Francis watched them together, seeing how naturally they'd fallen into a rhythm, how his daughter's face lit up with each small victory. Later, when Clara had been tucked into bed, Francis noticed Miriam kneeling in the shadows near the hearth, her head bowed in silent prayer. The firelight caught the simple cap covering her hair, cast soft shadows across her young face, set in peaceful devotion. Despite his misgivings about the attention her presence might bring, he couldn't deny the change she'd brought to his home in just one day. The cabin felt different somehow, warmer, not just in temperature but in spirit. Clara's excited chatter about her lessons, the mended mittens laid carefully by her bed, the lingering smell of fresh bread. It reminded him of better days, when his wife had filled these walls with similar touches of grace. Francis cleared his throat quietly. "Miss Stoltzfus." Miriam looked up from her prayers, eyes questioning. "Reckon you can stay another night," he said. "We'll figure out what's next in the morning." "Thank you, Mr. Rourke," she whispered, relief evident in her voice. "God bless you for your kindness." Francis nodded once and turned away, not trusting himself to speak further. He lay in his bed, listening to the familiar night sounds of the cabin, the pop of settling logs in the fireplace, Clara's soft breathing, and now the whisper of Miriam's prayers, wondering if he was doing right by his daughter, or if offering shelter to this girl would bring the very trouble he'd always sought to avoid by living so far from town. But watching Clara's peaceful sleep, her hornbook still clutched in one hand, he couldn't quite bring himself to regret his decision. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. For tonight, his home felt whole again in a way it hadn't for far too long. The morning sun had barely crested the mountain peaks when hoofbeats echoed up the snowy trail. Francis paused in his wood chopping, axe held mid-swing as he spotted Reverend Matthews approaching on his dappled mare. The preacher rarely ventured this far into the highlands, especially in winter. Francis planted his axe in the chopping block and brushed wood chips from his coat. "Morning, Reverend." "Mr. Rourke." The preacher's usual warmth seemed dampened by the frost in his voice. He dismounted stiffly, his black coat dusted with snow. "Thought I'd pay a pastoral visit given what I've been hearing in town." Inside the cabin, movement caught Francis's eye through the window, Miriam and Clara quickly stepping away from view. His jaw tightened. "Reckon you'd better come in out of the cold, then." The cabin's warmth hit them as they entered, carrying the scent of fresh coffee and the morning's biscuits. Miriam stood near the hearth, hands clasped modestly before her, while Clara peeked out from behind her skirts. "So it's true," Reverend Matthews said, his eyes fixed on Miriam. "There is an Amish girl here. Alone, unchaperoned." "She's no trouble," Francis said firmly. "She's been teaching Clara her letters." The preacher's brows drew together. "Mr. O'Rourke, surely you see how this looks. A young woman living under your roof? The gossip in town is already spreading like wildfire." "Begging your pardon, Reverend," Miriam spoke softly, though she kept her eyes lowered. "I mean no disrespect to anyone. I only wish to help with Clara's education." "Education?" The preacher's tone grew harsh. "Or are you hiding from something?" "Someone? We can't have fugitives bringing trouble to our peaceful community." Clara pressed closer to Miriam, small fingers gripping the older girl's skirt. Francis stepped between them and the preacher, his shadow falling across the room. "She's running from harm, not justice," Francis said, his voice low. But steady. "I won't turn her out to freeze or worse. You're playing with fire, Rourke." Reverend Matthews jabbed a finger toward Miriam. "That girl could bring all manner of difficulty down on your head." "What of her family? Her people? They'll come looking eventually." "Then I'll deal with that when it comes," Francis answered. "For now, she stays." The preacher's face darkened. "This is most irregular, most inappropriate. The town council will have something to say about this, mark my words." He turned toward the door, muttering, "Scandal. Pure scandal." Francis followed him out, watching as the preacher mounted his horse with jerky movements that spoke of his agitation. "Good day, Reverend," he said pointedly. The only response was a sharp kick to the mare's flanks as Reverend Matthews rode away, his back rigid with disapproval. Francis stood in the yard long after the hoofbeats faded, watching the trail that led down to town. Sure enough, within hours, the first curious visitors began to appear. A sled carrying the Cooper family glided past, their heads turning obviously toward the cabin. Later, the Petersons' wagon creaked by, loaded with nothing but their clear desire to glimpse the mysterious Amish girl. By afternoon, Miriam had grown pale with worry, starting at every sound from the trail. She kept to the shadows away from the windows, though she continued helping Clara with her reading, her voice soft but less certain than before. "Don't fret yourself," Francis told her as he came in from checking his trapline. "They'll tire of their nosiness soon enough." "I'm bringing trouble to your door," Miriam whispered. "Perhaps I should move on, find somewhere less visible to—" "No!" Clara abandoned her hornbook and rushed to Miriam's side. "Please don't go. You're the best teacher ever. Pa, tell her she can't leave." Francis hung his coat by the door, considering his words carefully. "Folks round here, they like their routines. Anything different sets them talking for a spell. But talk ain't action, and I won't let action come to harm you." Miriam's eyes glistened. "You've been so kind, Mr. Rourke. I don't want to repay that kindness with difficulty." "Ain't no difficulty having someone teach my girl proper," Francis replied. He watched as Clara snuggled closer to Miriam, the way his daughter's face lit up when she looked at her teacher. Something in his chest ached at the sight, not the sharp pain of loss he'd carried since his wife's death, but a softer feeling, like an old wound finally beginning to heal. "Teacher," Clara said suddenly, turning to Francis. "That's what Miriam is, Pa. A real teacher, just like in town. Better, even, 'cause she explains things so nice and clear." "Teacher," Francis repeated, the word settling. In his heart, like a warm coal. He remembered his own struggles with letters, how he'd given up trying to learn after too many harsh words from impatient schoolmasters. But Miriam's gentle way with Clara showed him what teaching could be. Patient, kind, encouraging. The sun was setting now, painting the snow outside in shades of rose and gold. Clara still clung to Miriam, unwilling to let go even as supper time approached. Francis watched them together, his daughter and this quiet girl who'd brought such unexpected change to their lives, and made his decision. "Miss Stoltzfus," he said formally, causing both females to look up at him. "I reckon you'd better stay on here for a while. We'll weather whatever talk comes our way." "But the preacher," Miriam began. "The preacher ain't living up here in these mountains," Francis cut in. "He ain't seeing how Clara's flourishing under your teaching, and he sure ain't the one to tell me who belongs in my home." Fresh tears spilled down Miriam's cheeks, but she smiled through them. "Thank you, Mr. Rourke. I'll work hard to deserve your trust." "You already have," he said gruffly, turning away to hide his own emotion. "Now, best get supper started before this one." He ruffled Clara's hair as he passed. "Starts gnawing on the furniture." Clara giggled, the sound bright and clear in the cabin's warmth. "Can we have more of Miriam's dumplings, Pa?" "Please." "Reckon that's up to your teacher there," Francis said, the word coming easier now. He caught Miriam's eye and nodded once, a silent confirmation of his decision. Outside, another sled passed by, its runners whispering through the snow. But inside the cabin, in the growing darkness held at bay by lamplight and the hearth's glow, Francis felt more certain than ever. Let them talk in town. Let them whisper and wonder. Some things were worth standing firm for, and the peace settling over his home now was one of them. Snow drifted down in lazy spirals outside the cabin windows, adding to the thick white blanket that already covered the Colorado highlands. Inside, warmth from the crackling fire pushed back the winter chill as Miriam sat with Clara at the rough-hewn table, a worn Bible open between them. "And the Lord said unto Moses," Clara read slowly, her finger tracing each word, "Go unto Pharaoh, and say unto him." Francis paused in his work of mending a broken trap chain to watch them. Clara's brow furrowed in concentration as she worked through the difficult words, while Miriam waited patiently beside her, offering gentle corrections when needed. The scene struck something deep in his chest, a feeling he had almost forgotten. "Very good," Miriam praised softly as Clara finished the passage. "Your reading improves every day." Clara beamed at the compliment, then turned to her father. "Did you hear me, Pa? I hardly made any mistakes." "Heard every word," Francis replied, his voice gruff with pride. "You're coming along fine." The days had settled into a comfortable routine since Francis had decided to let Miriam stay. She rose before dawn each morning to help with chores, taught Clara her lessons, and kept the cabin tidier than it had been in years. Her quiet presence seemed to fill empty spaces Francis hadn't even realized were there. That afternoon, as Francis returned from checking his trap lines, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Laughter. It spilled from the cabin like music, high and sweet. Through the window, he saw Miriam and Clara seated by the fire, heads bent together over something in their laps. Inside, he found them surrounded by scraps of cloth, bits of yarn, and stuffing made from clean straw. Clara held up a half-finished doll, her eyes shining. "Look, Pa! Miriam's teaching me to make a proper doll, not just the corn husk kind." "Is that so?" Francis hung his coat by the door, shaking off snow. "Looks right fancy?" Miriam's cheeks colored at his words. "It's just simple stitching, Mr. Rourke. Every girl should have a doll of her own." Clara carefully set down her sewing and ran to hug her father. "Tell us a story while we work, Pa. One of your trapping tales." Francis usually begged off such requests, but something about the moment, the warmth, the contentment in his daughter's face, softened his resolve. "Well?" He settled into his chair by the fire. "There was that time I tracked a silver fox through 3 feet of snow." As he spun his tale of outsmarting the clever fox, his own chuckles joined their laughter. The sound surprised him, rusty and uncertain at first, then fuller, like a creek breaking through spring ice. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. Later, as Miriam stirred the stew pot hanging over the fire, Francis found himself thinking of Sarah, his late wife. She used to laugh like that, filling their home with joy even during the hardest times. After her passing, the cabin had grown so quiet, he'd almost forgotten what such happiness sounded like. "Supper's ready," Miriam announced, ladling the rich-smelling stew into bowls. Clara scrambled to her place at the table, clutching her nearly finished doll. "Thank you for teaching me today, Miriam," Clara said as they settled in to eat. "Both the reading and the sewing." Miriam ducked her head modestly. "You're a wonderful student, Clara. It's my pleasure to teach you." Francis watched as Miriam bowed her head and began to pray quietly, her words soft but clear in the evening hush. After a moment's hesitation, he lowered his own head. The words felt strange on his tongue. He hadn't properly prayed since Sarah died, but something about joining in this simple grace felt right. The peaceful moment shattered at the sharp rap of knuckles against the cabin door. Francis rose quickly, tension returning to his shoulders. Visitors after dark usually meant trouble. He opened the door to find Tom Henderson, one of his nearest neighbors, standing in the swirling snow. The man's face was grave beneath his frost-covered hat brim. "Evening, Francis," Tom said, stamping his boots. "Hate to trouble you so late, but reckoned you ought to know. Railroad man's in town." Francis's jaw tightened. "What kind of railroad man?" "Land agent. Name's Maxwell. Been making rounds, talking to folks about selling their properties." Tom glanced past Francis to where Miriam and Clara sat frozen at the table. He's offering good money, they say, but those who ain't interested. He left the sentence hanging. Been hearing stories from down valley, Tom continued. Families getting pressured, mysterious fires, cattle scattered. Nothing that can be proved, mind you, but I understand, Francis said grimly. His hand tightened on the doorframe. The railroad had been pushing west for years, buying up land for new tracks and stations. Some called it progress, others called it theft. Just thought you should know, Tom said. Being up here alone and all. His eyes flicked to Miriam again. Well, not so alone now, I reckon. Much obliged for the warning, Francis replied. You ride careful heading home. After Tom left, Francis stood at the window, watching until his neighbor's lantern disappeared into the snowy darkness. When he turned back, he found Miriam and Clara watching him anxiously. What will we do, Pa? Clara asked in a small voice. Francis forced his features to soften. Nothing to fret about just yet. The railroad's been sniffing around these parts for years. But as he returned to his seat, his mind churned with worry. The homestead wasn't much. Just the cabin, the vegetable patch, and his trap lines. But it was theirs. He'd built it with Sarah, worked the land until his hands bled, buried his wife in the aspen grove beyond the creek. Everything he had, everything he was, lay rooted in this soil. Miriam seemed to sense his thoughts. God will provide, she said softly, her quiet faith steady as a mountain pine. He did not lead us this far to abandon us now. Francis looked at her, this gentle girl who had stumbled into their lives like a lost fawn, and felt something shift in his chest. The railroad might think him an easy target, a lone widower in a remote cabin, but they didn't know about the strength that could grow from broken pieces brought together, about the courage that came from protecting not just land, but family. Clara yawned, her earlier fears already fading as she cuddled her new doll. Can we finish the story about the fox tomorrow, Pa? Course we can, Francis assured her, reaching over to smooth her hair. Time for bed now, though. As Miriam helped Clara prepare for sleep, Francis added wood to the fire, watching the flames leap higher. Outside, snow continued to fall, wrapping the cabin in white silence. But inside, warmth bloomed like hope, defiant against the gathering storm. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Colorado highlands. Francis stood at the cabin door, pulling on his heavy coat while Miriam wrapped a wool scarf around his neck. Clara watched from her place by the fire, clutching her new doll tight. You'll be careful in town, won't you, Pa? She asked, her small face pinched with worry. Course I will, little one. Francis tugged his hat low against the morning chill. Just going to hear what this railroad fellow has to say, that's all. Miriam handed him a packet wrapped in cloth. I made cornbread for your ride. The day feels bitter. Francis nodded his thanks, touched by her thoughtfulness. Since her arrival, such small kindnesses had become part of their daily life. He mounted his horse, the animal's breath steaming in the frigid air, and set off down the snow-packed trail toward town. The ride gave him time to think. This land had been his home for 12 years now. He and Sarah had chosen it together, drawn by the clear creek and sheltered valley. Every log in the cabin, every fence post, bore the marks of their shared labor. Now Sarah lay beneath the aspens, and he had Clara to think about. And Miriam too, he realized with surprise. She had become part of their family so quickly, it seemed natural to include her in his concerns. The town was already bustling when Francis arrived. He tied his horse outside the general store, noting the cluster of men gathered around a stranger in a fine wool coat. The railroad agent, no doubt. Francis straightened his shoulders and approached. Ah, Mr. Rourke! The stranger turned, revealing a smooth-shaven face and city clothes. I'm Theodore Maxwell, representing the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad Company. I've been hoping to speak with you. Francis nodded stiffly. Heard you've been making offers. Indeed. Maxwell gestured toward the hotel. Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere warmer. Over coffee? Inside the hotel's small dining room, Maxwell spread maps across the table. Red lines marked existing tracks, with dotted lines showing proposed routes. One such line cut directly through Francis's valley. You see the problem, Maxwell said, tapping the map. The current route adds nearly 40 miles of track. Your land offers a more direct path. He named a sum that made several nearby men whistle. Cash payment, mister. Rourke, enough to set yourself up handsomely elsewhere. Francis studied the map, his jaw tight. Not interested. Mister. Rourke Maxwell's voice held a note of warning. Progress cannot be stopped. The railroad will come through one way or another. Better to profit from it than stand in its way. That land's not for sale, Francis said firmly, at any price. Tom Henderson stepped forward. Think on it, Francis. That's good money he's offering. Could buy twice the land down valley. Other voices joined in, urging him to be reasonable, to think of his daughter's future. Francis felt their pressure like a physical weight, but held firm. My answer's still no. Maxwell's pleasant expression hardened. Very well, but I strongly suggest you reconsider. The railroad has ways of dealing with obstacles. The threat hung in the air as Francis pushed back his chair. Without another word, he strode out into the street, ignoring the mutters that followed him. The ride home seemed longer, darkness gathering early under heavy clouds. When he finally reached the cabin, Miriam and Clara were waiting. The lamp burned bright in the window, and savory smells drifted from the cooking pot. Francis felt some of his tension ease as he stepped inside. How did it go, Pa? Clara asked, helping him with his coat. Francis sank into his chair by the fire. Not good. He described the meeting, Maxwell's offer, and the barely veiled threats. Man acts like he owns the whole territory already. To his surprise, Miriam spoke up from her place at the table. Did he show you the official railroad grant papers? Francis turned to her, startled. What? The railroad's land grant documents, Miriam explained. From my schooling, I know they must prove their right to claim territory. They cannot simply take what they want without proper filings. Francis stared at her. You know about such things? Miriam nodded, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. In our community, we were taught to understand deeds and contracts. Many tried to cheat the Amish, thinking us simple. Knowledge became our protection. Clara leaned forward, eyes wide. What else do you know, Miriam? Well, Miriam reached for paper and pencil. First, homesteaders have rights. The law protects those who work the land. Her neat handwriting filled the page as she sketched out legal terms and procedures. And citizens can petition against unjust takings, if enough join together. Francis watched in amazement as she explained concepts he had never considered. Her quiet voice held confidence when speaking of these matters, though she remained humble. You really think we could fight them? He asked. With papers and petitions? The law exists to protect all people, Miriam said softly, even against powerful companies, but we must know how to use it. Clara bounced with excitement. Can we help, Miriam? Can you teach us? Of course. Miriam smiled. Your father's reading has improved greatly. Together we can draft the documents needed. Francis felt hope stir in his chest. He had expected to face the railroad with nothing but stubborn determination. Now, Miriam offered a different kind of weapon. Knowledge. Then let's begin, he said, pulling his chair to the table. They worked by lamplight, Miriam guiding Francis's rough hand as he practiced writing formal phrases. Clara fetched more paper and ink, proud to be helping. Outside, wolves began their nightly chorus, their howls carrying across the snowy valley. Francis glanced at the window, thinking of other predators circling their home. Don't fear, Miriam said, as if reading his thoughts. God sends help in unexpected ways. Perhaps this is why he led me here. Frances met her steady gaze across the table. This slight girl, who had arrived barefoot in winter, now offered them hope of saving their land. The Lord did work in mysterious ways. "Reckon you might be right about that," he said softly. They bent back to their work, 3 heads close together in the lamp's golden circle. The wolves sang on in the darkness, but inside the cabin, determination grew stronger than fear. Together, they would find a way to protect their home. The week following their confrontation with the railroad agent brought changes to the Rourke cabin. Dawn light found Frances, Clara, and Miriam settling into a steady rhythm, as natural as the creek's flow beneath winter ice. Each morning, Frances rose first, stoking the banked fire before heading out to check his trap lines. He would return to find Clara and Miriam already busy with morning chores, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, and hauling fresh water from the creek. The sight of them working together, their breaths making little clouds in the cold air, brought an unexpected warmth to his chest. "Pa, look," Clara called one morning, proudly holding up a perfectly darned sock. "Miriam showed me how to mend it proper." "Fine work," Frances nodded, noticing how his daughter's small hands had grown steadier with the needle. Miriam stood nearby, ducking her head modestly at his praise of her teaching. After the morning tasks, they gathered around the table where Miriam had set up a makeshift schoolroom. Frances found himself lingering longer before heading out, drawn by Clara's eager voice sounding out new words. "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog," Clara read carefully from the practice sheet Miriam had written. "That's got all the letters in it, don't it?" "Indeed, it does," Miriam smiled. "Very. Good, Clara. Your reading improves every day." Afternoons brought focused work on their petition against the railroad. Miriam's neat handwriting filled page after page as she explained legal terms and proper phrasing. Frances struggled with the formal language, but his determination drove him to practice until his fingers ached from gripping the pencil. "Remember," Miriam would say gently, "each word must be clear and true. We are asking for justice, not favors." The evening hours found them gathered close around the lamp, drafting letters to other homesteaders who might join their cause. Clara helped by copying addresses onto envelopes, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. When Sunday arrived, Frances stood before his mirror, adjusting his rarely worn tie. The decision to take Miriam to church weighed heavy on his mind, but something in him refused to leave her behind, like a secret to be ashamed of. "You don't have to come," he told her gruffly. "Townfolk can be mighty unwelcoming to strangers." Miriam looked up from helping Clara with her Sunday ribbons. "The Lord's house should welcome all his children," she said simply. "I am not afraid." The wagon ride to town was quiet, save for the creak of wheels on packed snow. Clara sat between them on the bench, clutching her Bible with mittened hands. As they approached the white-painted church, Frances noticed heads turning, whispers starting. The morning sun streamed through tall windows as they found seats near the back. Miriam's plain dress and white cap stood out among the colorful Sunday finery. Clara pressed close to her side, eyes wide at the mounting tension in the air. Reverend Phillips's sermon spoke of Christian charity, but his gaze repeatedly strayed to their pew with obvious disapproval. The hymns rose around them, though few nearby voices joined theirs. Frances found himself singing louder than usual, as if to drown out the murmurs. After the final "Amen," they tried to make a quiet exit, but a group of townspeople blocked their path on the church steps. Frances Rourke, Tom Henderson's wife, stepped forward, her face pinched with disapproval. "Have you lost all sense of propriety? Housing an unknown girl, bringing her to church like she's family? Ain't natural," another woman added. "A widower with a young daughter, taking in a strange woman." "People are talking." "What people say ain't my concern," Frances replied firmly, though he felt Clara shrinking against his leg. "It should be," Tom Henderson joined in. "Think of your reputation, man. Think of Clara's future in this town." Miriam stood quietly, her head bowed, but her spine straight. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I thank you for your concern for this family, but God knows what is in our hearts." "The girl's right," Francis said, surprising himself. "The Lord tells us to help those in need. I reckon that matters more than talk." He placed a protective hand on Miriam's shoulder, guiding her and Clara through the crowd to their waiting wagon. The ride home was tense until Clara broke the silence. "You were brave, Miriam," she said, "like Daniel in the lion's den." A small smile touched Miriam's lips. Daniel had faith that God would protect him, as do I. That evening they gathered as usual around the lamp. But instead of working on petitions, Clara pulled out her Bible, opening it to a marked page. "May I read aloud?" she asked. "I've been practicing this part." Francis nodded, his throat tight with sudden emotion. Clara's voice rose clear and steady in the quiet cabin. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Francis watched his daughter's finger moving surely across the page, no longer stumbling over the words. He remembered how she had struggled just weeks ago, frustration bringing tears to her eyes. Now she read with confidence, thanks to Miriam's patient teaching. The Psalm's familiar words filled the cabin with peace. Francis glanced at Miriam, who sat with her hands folded, listening with quiet joy to her student's success. In that moment, he felt a certainty settle in his heart. She had been sent to them. In their time of need, Clara's loneliness, his helplessness against the railroad, their shared grief, God had guided this gentle soul to their door. The lamp's glow seemed to wrap them in a warm circle of light, a family bound by something deeper than blood. Outside, the winter wind moaned across the valley, and in the gathering darkness, unseen riders reined their horses to a stop on a distant ridge. Their eyes fixed on the cabin's bright window, their intentions hidden in shadow. But inside, Clara's voice continued steady and strong. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." "Amen," Miriam whispered. Francis echoed softly, "Amen," knowing that whatever threats lay ahead, they would face them together. The February thaw came sudden and sweet, softening the snow-crusted valley. Water dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across patches of exposed earth. Francis stood on his porch, breathing in the promising scent of warming soil. Inside the cabin, Clara's voice rose and fell in careful rhythm. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" "Very good," Miriam encouraged. "Remember to pause at the semicolon, just as we practiced." Francis listened through the open door, marveling at how his daughter's reading had strengthened. Gone was the halting uncertainty of just weeks ago. In its place flowed confidence, nurtured by Miriam's patient guidance. A thought had been growing in his mind, taking root like spring seeds in warming ground. Perhaps if others could hear Clara read, if they could witness the gift Miriam had brought to their home, hearts might soften toward the strange girl in their midst. That evening, after Clara had gone to bed, Francis cleared his throat. "Been thinking," he said to Miriam. "Might invite the Hendersons and Widow McPherson over. Let them hear Clara read some." Miriam looked up from her mending, surprise clear in her eyes. "You believe that would help?" "Reckon so." Francis shifted in his chair. "Martha Henderson's got 3 little ones who ain't learned their letters yet. And the widow, well, she's always had a soft spot for Clara." A small smile touched Miriam's lips. "Clara would like that. She's been wanting to show someone besides us how well she reads now." 2 days later, the chosen neighbors arrived in their Sunday best, curiosity evident in their careful greetings. Francis had swept the cabin floor, and Miriam had set out her best cornbread, still warm from the oven. "Now, Clara," Martha Henderson said, settling into a chair. "Your pa tells us you've been learning to read proper. Clara nodded, clutching her Bible close. She looked to Miriam, who gave her an encouraging smile. "Would you read for us?" Widow McPherson asked kindly. "Perhaps that psalm you've been practicing." Clara took a deep breath and opened to the marked page. Her voice started soft, but grew stronger with each word. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." Frances watched the visitors' faces as Clara read. Martha Henderson's eyes widened at the child's clear pronunciation. The widow dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even Tom Henderson, who had been among the most vocal critics at church, sat straighter in his chair. When Clara finished, silence held for a moment before Martha spoke. "Why, I never heard such fine reading from one so young." She turned to Miriam. "You taught her all this?" "Clara is an eager student," Miriam answered modestly. "She works very hard." "My Tommy's 8 now and can barely write his name," Martha mused. "I don't suppose—" "Miriam could teach him too," Clara piped up. "She's ever so patient." The evening ended with warm handshakes and thoughtful expressions. As their guests departed, Frances overheard Martha telling her husband, "Maybe we were hasty in our judgment." Word spread through the valley like spring runoff. Frances's little girl could read, really read, not just recite from memory. More neighbors began stopping by, ostensibly to trade goods or share news, but their eyes would linger on Clara as she sat with her. Books. The railroad question still loomed, though. When notice came of a town meeting at the church, Frances knew they couldn't stay away. The evening air was mild as they drove their wagon toward town, the last snowdrifts melting in the ditches. The one-room church was packed tight, smelling of damp wool and wood smoke. Railroad men in sharp suits stood at the front, while townsfolk filled the pews. Frances guided Clara and Miriam to seats near the back, feeling the weight of stairs. The railroad agent, Mr. Patterson, spoke of progress and profit, his voice smooth as creek ice. "This railway will bring prosperity to your valley," he promised. "Those who cooperate will be well compensated." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded eagerly, while others frowned. Frances's jaw tightened as he thought of his homestead, built with his own hands. "The law is clear," Patterson continued. "The railway has right-of-way authority. Those who resist will—" "Please, sir." Clara's small voice cut through the man's speech. She had risen from her seat, clutching her Bible. "May I read something?" The agent blinked, thrown off his practiced words. Reverend Phillips stepped forward, concern creasing his brow. "Clara, child, let her read," called Widow McPherson from her pew. "Let's hear what the good book says." Frances held his breath as Clara walked to the front, her shoes tapping softly on wooden floorboards. Miriam sat perfectly still beside him, hands clasped in prayer. Clara opened her Bible to a ribbon marker and began to read, her voice clear as a mountain stream. "Blessed are they that maintain justice, and he that doeth righteousness at all times." The church fell silent. Even the railroad men stopped shuffling their papers. "The Lord loves righteousness and justice," Clara continued steadily. "The earth is full of his unfailing love." She read on, each word distinct and sure, just as Miriam had taught her. Frances watched faces in the crowd soften, transform. Martha Henderson wiped tears from her cheeks. Tom nodded slowly, his usual scowl melting away. When Clara finished, she looked up at the stunned assembly. "Miriam taught me that passage," she said simply. "She says it reminds us to be fair and kind to all people." Reverend Phillips cleared his throat, his earlier sternness replaced by something gentler. "Thank you, Clara. Indeed, we must remember that justice and kindness are the Lord's way." He turned to the railroad men. "Perhaps we should take time to consider all aspects of this matter more carefully." The meeting dissolved into smaller discussions, but the mood had shifted. Neighbors who had avoided Frances now came to shake his hand. Several mothers approached Miriam, asking about reading lessons for their children. Never heard. A child read so well, the Reverend said, pausing by their pew. You've done fine work with her, Miss Stoltzfus. Miriam blushed. Clara has a gift. I merely helped her find it. As they prepared to leave, Francis noticed Mr. Patterson watching them with narrowed eyes, but for once, he felt no fear. Clara's words had awakened something in the community, a reminder of what truly mattered. The wagon ride home was quiet but peaceful. Stars emerged in the deepening blue sky, and a chorus of spring peepers rose from the thawing marsh. Clara dozed against Miriam's shoulder while Francis guided the horses through familiar turns. Pride swelled in his chest as he recalled his daughter's courage. She had done more than read well. She had spoken truth to power with the simple faith of a child. And Miriam had made it possible, this gentle soul who had appeared at their door like an answer to an unspoken prayer. For this one evening at least, hope glowed warm as lamplight. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they were no longer facing them alone. The wagon wheels creaked softly as Francis guided them home beneath a tapestry of stars. Clara sat between him and Miriam on the wooden seat, humming quietly to herself. The night air carried the first hints of spring thaw, though patches of snow still gleamed silver in the moonlight. Back at the cabin, Francis stoked the fire while Miriam prepared a simple supper of cornbread and stew. The warmth of their victory at the church meeting still glowed within them all. Clara could hardly contain her excitement as she set the table, practically bouncing with each trip between cupboard and table. "Did you see their faces, Pa?" Clara bubbled, spooning stew into bowls. "Even Reverend Phillips smiled at me." Francis's weathered face softened. "You did real fine, child. Real fine." "And Mr. Henderson wasn't frowning anymore," Clara continued. "Mrs. Henderson asked if Tommy could come learn his letters too." Miriam set the cornbread on the table, her quiet smile illuminated by lamplight. "You read beautifully, Clara. Clear and strong, just as we practiced." They settled around the table, steam rising from their bowls. Francis paused before picking up his spoon, something shifting in his expression. He cleared his throat. "Miriam," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I ain't properly thanked you for all you've done here." He gestured to Clara, to the books stacked neatly by the hearth, to the mended clothes hanging near the fire. "You've brought light back to this home. Learning, too, and—" He swallowed hard. "Well, I'm much obliged." Color rose in Miriam's cheeks. "Your kindness in sheltering me was thanks enough, Mr. Rourke. Francis," he corrected gently, "reckon you've earned the right to use my given name." Clara beamed at them both, her smile bright as sunshine. The cabin felt warmer somehow, more like the home it had been before Francis's wife passed. They ate together, sharing quiet conversation and occasional laughter, at peace in each other's company. The sudden thunder of hooves shattered their contentment. Francis rose swiftly, moving to the window. In the yard, shadows moved against the snow. Riders, at least 6 of them. The harsh glow of lanterns cut through the darkness. "Get back from the door," Francis ordered, reaching for his rifle above the mantel. But before he could grab it, the cabin door burst open with a crash. Men poured in, led by Mr. Patterson, the railroad agent. His fancy suit was dusty from riding, his face twisted with anger. Behind him came Tom Henderson and several other townsmen Francis recognized, their expressions hard and unfamiliar. "There she is!" Patterson spat, pointing at Miriam. "The vagrant who's been stirring up trouble!" Clara screamed as rough hands seized Miriam's arms. The girl's face went white with terror, but she didn't struggle. "Let her be!" Francis lunged forward, but 2 men grabbed him. A fist struck his jaw, sending him staggering. "Pa!" Clara tried to run to him, but Widow McPherson appeared in the doorway, holding the child back. "This is for the best, Francis," the widow said, though her voice shook. "The girl's presence here ain't proper. She's got no rights to stay." She's done nothing wrong." Francis struggled against the men holding him, earning another brutal blow to his ribs. He doubled over, gasping. "She's a squatter," Patterson declared, "using a child to manipulate honest folk against progress. We're taking her to town for the sheriff to deal with." "No!" Clara sobbed, fighting against the widow's grip. "Miriam! Don't let them take her!" Miriam's voice rose clear despite her fear. "Francis, please, don't fight them. I'll go peacefully." Her eyes found Clara's tear-streaked face. "Be brave, little one." "Keep reading your verses." The men dragged Miriam toward the door. Francis surged up again, blood trickling from his split lip. This time 3 men fell on him with fists and boots. Pain exploded through his body as they drove him to the floor. Through blurred vision, he saw Miriam being pulled into the snowy night. Her plain dress gleamed pale in the lantern light before the darkness swallowed her. The thunder of hooves grew distant, carrying her away. The attackers released Francis, leaving him sprawled on the rough floorboards. The widow let go of Clara, who ran to her father, crying hysterically. "You'll thank us later," Tom Henderson muttered, not meeting Francis's eyes. "This is how things have to be." The men filed out, boots heavy on the porch steps. The door swung shut behind them, leaving the cabin in terrible silence, broken only by Clara's heartbroken sobs. Francis lay there, tasting blood and defeat. Every breath sent daggers through his ribs where they'd kicked him. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the fury and despair that crushed his chest. They'd torn apart his family again, just when he'd begun to hope. Clara clung to him, her tears soaking his shirt. "Pa, we have to help her. We have to get Miriam back." Francis pulled his daughter close, though it made his injuries scream. He had no words of comfort to offer. The night pressed in around them, cold and empty where warmth had been only moments before. Their happy evening lay shattered like the broken crockery scattered across the floor. Another wound to bear, another loss to endure in this harsh land. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting wavering shadows on the walls. Francis stared into the flames, his jaw clenched against pain both physical and spiritual. The evening that had held such promise now felt like a cruel joke. The railroad men had taken more than Miriam. They'd stolen hope itself, leaving only bitter ashes in its place. Dawn crept through the frosted windows, painting pale squares on the cabin floor. Francis lay on his bed, every breath a knife between his ribs. The night had been endless, filled with Clara's tears and his own dark thoughts. Now morning brought no comfort, only the harsh reality of what they'd lost. He tried to sit up, biting back a groan. His body protested, bruises blooming purple across his chest and face. Clara stirred from where she'd finally fallen asleep beside him, her cheeks still tear-stained. "Pa?" Her voice was small, frightened. "Are you hurting bad?" Francis forced a smile, though it pulled at his split lip. "Just stiff, child. Nothing that won't mend." But when he swung his legs over the bed's edge, pain shot through him like lightning. He closed his eyes, steadying himself against the wave of dizziness. Clara scrambled up, hovering anxiously. "Let me help, Pa." Like Miriam showed me with the herbs, the name hung heavy in the air between them. Francis nodded, letting Clara fetch the tin of dried yarrow and arnica Miriam had prepared weeks ago. His daughter's hands trembled as she mixed the herbs with snow-melted water, just as she'd been taught. "Why did they take her, Pa?" Clara pressed the damp cloth to his bruised face. "She never did nothing wrong. She just helped us." Francis had no answer that would satisfy a child's sense of justice. "Sometimes folks get scared of what they don't understand, Clara. Makes them do cruel things." "But why did God let it happen?" Clara's voice cracked. "Miriam prays every day. She teaches me Bible verses. Why didn't he protect her?" The question struck deep, echoing Francis's own struggles with faith since losing his wife. He looked at his daughter's tear-bright eyes, searching for words of comfort but finding none. Something broke inside him then. Slowly, Painfully, he lowered himself to his knees beside the bed. Clara watched, wide-eyed, as he bowed his head. "Lord," Francis whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I ain't been much for praying these past years. Reckon I've been angry. Blamed you for taking Sarah." He swallowed hard. "But I'm asking now. Give me strength to make this right. Help me protect them both, my girl and the one you sent to teach her." Clara knelt beside him, slipping her small hand into his. "Amen," she whispered. Francis squeezed her fingers gently. "We ain't giving up on Miriam, child. I promise you that." He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the protest of his battered body. Clara helped him dress, then built up the fire while he moved carefully around the cabin, gathering what they needed. From the shelf came Miriam's neat stack of petitions, her careful handwriting laying out their land rights. Francis added Clara's practice pages, showing her progress from struggling with letters to reading whole passages. Last, he collected the clothing Miriam had mended, his shirts with their even stitches, Clara's dresses let out with careful patches. "See here," he showed Clara, pointing to the neat seams. "This is proof of who she is. No vagrant sews like this. No troublemaker spends hours teaching a child to read." Clara touched the fabric reverently. "She made everything pretty again." "That she did." Francis wrapped the items carefully in clean cloth. "And not just the sewing, neither. She brought light back to this home, same as your mama once did." The day passed slowly as Francis tended necessary chores, each movement a battle against pain. Clara stayed close, helping more than usual with the animals and water fetching. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the mountains, promising more snow. "Time to get ready," Francis told Clara as the light began to fade. "Dress warm now. We've got a cold ride ahead." Clara pulled on her heaviest clothes, while Francis saddled old Jake, his sturdy mule. The beast stood patient in the yard, breath steaming in the chill air. Francis secured their proof bundle behind the saddle, then helped Clara up. He wrapped her in thick blankets until only her eyes showed. Mounting was agony. Francis clenched his teeth, willing himself not to show weakness as pain lanced through his ribs. Once settled, he gathered the reins in stiff fingers. "Hold tight to me, child," he instructed. Clara pressed close against his back, small arms circling his waist. The sun was setting as they started down the trail, painting the snow-covered peaks in fierce oranges and purples. Old Jake picked his way carefully through the drifts, hooves crunching in the crusty snow. Each step jolted Francis's injuries, but he kept his focus on the lights of town beginning to twinkle in the valley below. "Pa?" Clara's voice was muffled by blankets. "What if they won't listen?" "Then we'll make them listen." Francis's tone was grim but determined. "Miriam taught us both that words have power. Time to use that power for her sake." The temperature dropped as darkness fell. Wind whispered through bare branches, carrying the promise of storm. Francis hunched forward, trying to block the worst of the cold from Clara. His bruised face ached in the bitter air, but something stronger than pain drove him forward. Prayer still felt strange on his lips after so long, but Francis found himself murmuring as they rode, "Lord, give us strength. Show us the way." The words brought unexpected comfort, like a warm hand on his shoulder. The town's lights grew closer, yellow windows glowing against the gathering night. Somewhere down there, Miriam waited. Francis touched the bundle of proof, remembering her gentle voice teaching Clara, her quiet strength in the face of prejudice. She'd brought healing to his broken home, and he'd let her be taken. That shame burned hotter than his physical pain. "We're coming, Miriam," he whispered into the wind. "Hold fast." Old Jake plodded steadily downward, carrying his precious cargo toward whatever waited in the valley below. Francis sat straight despite his injuries, Clara warm against his back, as the first snowflakes began to fall. They had truth on their side now, and newly rekindled faith to light their way. It would have to be enough. The storm grew fiercer as old Jake picked his way down the mountain trail. Francis hunched over the reins, shielding Clara from the stinging snow. His bruised body ached with each careful step, but he pressed on until dim lantern light pierced the darkness ahead. Tom Wheeler's barn. Tom was one of the few neighbors who'd shown kindness when Miriam first arrived, even bringing over a basket of fall apples for Clara. Francis guided old Jake toward the weathered structure, praying his friend's compassion would extend to shelter on this bitter night. The barn door creaked open before Francis could dismount. Tom's broad figure appeared, holding a lantern high. "Lord have mercy, Francis Rourke," Tom called over the wind. "What brings you out in this weather?" His eyes widened as the light caught Francis's battered face. "And what happened to you?" "Need a place to weather the storm?" Francis managed through chattering teeth. "Got business in town come morning." Tom stepped forward, helping Clara down from the mule. "Get on inside, both of you." Martha's got soup warming on the stove. Francis's stiff muscles protested as he swung down from the saddle. Tom caught his arm when he stumbled, steadying him without comment. Together they led old Jake into the barn's welcomed warmth, where sweet hay scent mixed with leather and livestock. "Railroad men came calling, didn't they?" Tom asked quietly as he helped Francis settle Clara in a clean hay pile. The little girl was already half asleep, exhausted from their cold journey. Francis nodded grimly. "Took Miriam. Beat me when I tried to stop them." "Heard tell they locked her up in town jail," Tom said, spreading a horse blanket over Clara. "Claiming vagrancy charges, but word is the railroad agent pushed for it, trying to pressure you about the land, I reckon." "You heard right." Francis pulled the bundle of proof from his saddlebag, hands trembling with cold and fatigue. "Got evidence here showing she ain't no vagrant. Letters, petitions, her sewing work. More than that, she's family now." Tom's wife Martha appeared with 2 steaming cups. "Drink this," she ordered, pressing hot coffee into their hands. "Then you tell us how we can help." Francis sipped gratefully, letting the warmth seep into his bones. Tom and Martha settled on hay bales nearby, their faces troubled but kind in the lantern light. Francis spread out his evidence between them. Miriam's careful penmanship on the petitions, Clara's reading progress, the neat mending that showed a skilled hand. "Look here," Francis said, pointing to a Bible verse Clara had copied in wobbly letters. "My girl couldn't read a word 3 months ago. Now she knows scripture better than half the town, thanks to Miriam's teaching." Martha touched the fabric of a mended shirt. "This is fine work. Patient work. Not the kind done by someone meaning trouble." "She's changed our lives," Francis admitted quietly, watching Clara sleep. "Brought light back to our home. I aim to stand up for her tomorrow, God willing." "You mean to confront Reverend Stone?" Tom asked. "And that railroad fellow?" Francis nodded. "Figure church gathering's my best chance. Make them face the truth in front of everybody." "It's risky," Tom warned. "That agent's got some rough men backing him." "I know, but I've got truth on my side now." Francis touched the papers spread before them. "And maybe the Lord too, if he's listening." Martha squeezed his shoulder gently. "He's listening, Francis. Rest now. You'll need strength for tomorrow." But sleep proved elusive. Francis sat propped against a hay bale, watching shadows dance on the barn walls as the storm raged outside. Every creak and groan of the timbers made him think of Miriam alone in that cold jail cell. Had anyone brought her a blanket? Was she praying still, keeping faith despite everything? He studied the papers in the dim light, committing key points to memory. His ribs throbbed, and his face felt hot and swollen, but the pain only fueled his determination. Come morning, he would make them understand what they'd done, not just to Miriam, but to the very heart of their community. Dawn arrived pale and quiet, the storm spent. Clara stirred as first light filtered through the barn slats. Francis helped her straighten her clothes and smooth her hair, just as Miriam would have done. "Remember what we practiced?" he asked softly. Clara nodded, clutching her own small Bible. "I'm ready, Pa." Tom offered them breakfast, but Francis's stomach was too knotted to eat. He managed a few sips of coffee while Martha fussed over Clara, making sure the child had warm milk and biscuits. "We'll be there," Tom promised, as Francis gathered their things. "Whatever happens." The walk to the church seemed endless. Francis's injuries had stiffened overnight, making each step an exercise in will. Clara held his hand, matching his slow pace without complaint. A few early risers hurried past them on the street, heads down against the morning chill. The white clapboard church stood stark against the winter sky. Already people were gathering, stamping snow from their boots on the steps. Francis noticed several railroad men among them, including the agent who'd led the attack on his home. The man's eyes narrowed when he spotted Francis, but he quickly looked away. Francis stopped in the churchyard, kneeling carefully to Clara's level. "You stay close by me, child. If things turn ugly, you run to Tom and Martha, understand?" "Yes, Pa." Clara's small face was solemn. "But they won't hurt you again. God won't let them." Her simple faith touched something deep in Francis's battered heart. He hugged her close, drawing strength from her trust. Together they waited as more townspeople arrived, the crowd growing larger than usual for a normal service. Reverend Stone appeared in his black coat, Bible tucked under his arm. He faltered slightly upon seeing Francis and Clara, but recovered quickly, nodding to various congregants as he mounted the steps. Francis felt the weight of stares as neighbors noticed him standing there, his bruised face a stark testimony to violence done. Some looked away in shame, others with defiance. A few, like Tom and Martha who had just arrived, moved closer in silent support. The church bell began to toll, calling everyone inside. Francis squeezed Clara's hand, waiting until most had entered. His heart pounded painfully against his injured ribs, but his voice was steady when he whispered, "Ready?" Clara pressed close to his side. "Ready, Pa," she breathed back. "Miriam taught us. To be brave, remember?" Francis touched the evidence in his coat pocket, proof of a good woman's worth, of a child's growing knowledge, of a family knit together by love and grace. He thought of Miriam's quiet strength, her gentle ways, her steadfast heart. The bell's last echo faded into morning stillness. "That she did, child," he murmured. "That she did." Together they climbed the church steps, Clara's small hand warm in his, as the congregation settled into their pews for morning prayers. Francis paused in the doorway, gathering his courage for what must come next. Inside the church, a hush fell over the crowded pews. As Francis made his way down the center aisle, Clara held close against his side. Morning light filtered through frosted windows, casting long shadows across worn floorboards. The congregation's whispers faded to silence as Francis reached the front, turning to face his neighbors. His bruised face testified to the violence he'd endured, but he stood straight and tall before them. With gentle hands, he helped Clara settle on the front pew before reaching into his coat. One by one, he withdrew the precious pieces of evidence: Miriam's careful needlework, her neat petitions, Clara's practice pages. "Good folk," he began, his voice rough but carrying clearly through the hushed sanctuary. "You know me. Known me 15 years since I first settled here. Never been one for many words." He held up one of Miriam's mended shirts. "But today I must speak for someone who can't defend herself." The fabric caught the light as he displayed the tiny, even stitches. "This here is Miriam Stoltzfus's work. Look close at it. These ain't the stitches of some vagrant or troublemaker. These are the careful marks of a decent girl who gives her whole heart to whatever tasks before her." He laid the shirt aside and lifted the petitions. "And here's her writing, helping us fight fair against the railroad's claims on our land. Not sneaking or scheming, but using the law proper, teaching me things I never knew about deeds and rights. The railroad agent shifted in his seat, face darkening, but Francis pressed on. 3 months ago, my Clara couldn't read a word. Now. He turned to his daughter. Show them, child. Show them what Miriam taught you. Clara stood, small Bible clutched in her hands. Her voice wavered at first but grew stronger as she read, The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. The familiar words rang clear and true through the church. Francis watched faces in the crowd soften, saw handkerchiefs appear as some of the women dabbed at their eyes. Even Reverend Stone's stern expression flickered with something like doubt. Clara continued reading, each word a testament to Miriam's. Patient teaching. When she finished, the silence held a different quality, no longer hostile but thoughtful. That's the gift Miriam brought to our home, Francis said into that silence. Not just reading, but hope. Light, the sound of laughter again after too many quiet years. His voice grew husky. She came to us seeking shelter, and in return she gave us back our joy. He faced the preacher directly now. Reverend, you speak often of Christian charity, of mercy. Well, I've seen mercy lived out these past months through that girl's quiet ways. She never spoke against those who wronged her. Never asked for more than a warm hearth and the chance to be useful. Turning to the congregation, Francis spread his hands. Look at your own children, your grandchildren. How many can read like Clara does now? How many know their scripture so well? That's Miriam's doing. A girl you've locked away like a criminal, whose only crime was having nowhere else to turn. Someone in the back called out, But she's a runaway. Aye, she ran, Francis acknowledged. Ran from an uncle who would have crushed her spirit and stolen her inheritance. Should we punish her for choosing life over slavery? For seeking honest work instead of submission to cruelty? He could see his words landing now, watch them take root in troubled faces. The railroad agent stood suddenly, his chair scraping loud against the floor. This is all very touching, Rourke, but it doesn't change the fact that you're harboring a fugitive, and it certainly doesn't affect the railroad's legitimate claim to your land. Francis met the man's glare steadily. If you want my land, sir, fight me for it in court. Bring your lawyers and your papers. We'll meet you there with our own. But don't hide behind false charges against an innocent girl. Don't use mob violence to force what you can't win legally. Murmurs rose from the congregation. Francis heard approval, mixing with the uncertainty now. He pressed his advantage. We're frontier folk. We know about hard choices and desperate times. Every one of us came here seeking something. Freedom, fortune, a fresh start. Are we so quick to forget our own beginnings that we'd deny another soul the same chance? He gathered Miriam's sewing and papers close. I'm not asking you to take my word alone. Judge her by her deeds, by the child she's taught, by the home she's helped rebuild. His voice softened. By the grace she's shown even to those who showed her none. Clara slipped her small hand into his as he continued. Whatever you decide here today, know this, I won't sell my land to men who use force instead of law, and I won't abandon someone who's become family to me and my girl, no matter what it costs. The railroad agent's face had grown thunderous, but he held his tongue as approving murmurs grew stronger. Francis saw heads nodding, watched neighbors lean close to whisper. The preacher stood, raising his hands for quiet. Mister, Rourke has given us much to consider, Reverend Stone said slowly. Perhaps in our haste to judge, we have overlooked evidence of God's own hand at work among us. The agent started to protest, but the preacher silenced him with a look. This is a house of God, sir, and at this moment we are discussing matters of conscience and community. Your business interests, while significant, must wait. Francis felt hope kindle in his chest as the Reverend continued. I move that we review the charges against Miss Stoltzfus with more Christian charity, and that any further discussions about property be conducted through proper legal channels, not through force. The congregation stirred, and Francis heard scattered amens from various corners. He watched the railroad agent's face darken further, but the man held his peace, clearly recognizing the shift in public sentiment. Clara tugged at Francis's sleeve, whispering, "Does this mean Miriam can come home?" Francis squeezed her hand, speaking loud enough for all to hear. "God willing, child. If there's justice in this town, she'll be back with us soon." The morning light had strengthened as they stood there, streaming through the windows in bright shafts that seemed to illuminate the truth of his words. Francis gathered his evidence carefully, sensing victory but knowing the real work of changing hearts had only begun. Still, as he looked out over the faces of his neighbors, some ashamed, some thoughtful, some openly supportive now, he felt a surge of gratitude for Clara's courage, for Miriam's quiet strength that had brought them to this moment, for the power of truth spoken plainly, and for the chance to stand up for what was right. The church fell silent after Francis's impassioned speech. Dust motes danced in the morning light streaming through the windows, and the only sound was the creak of wooden pews as the congregation shifted uneasily. All eyes turned to Reverend Stone, who remained seated, his weathered hands clasped before him. After what seemed an eternity, the preacher rose slowly to his feet. His boots echoed on the wooden floor as he made his way to the pulpit. He gripped its edges, looking out over his flock with troubled eyes. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I stand before you today convicted of a grave error. In our haste to protect our community, we have committed an injustice against one of God's own children." He paused, his gaze settling on Francis and Clara. "We were quick to judge Miss Stoltzfus by her circumstances rather than her character. We saw a stranger where we should have seen a neighbor. We chose fear over faith, suspicion over charity." The preacher's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Last night, men of this town, some standing in this very church, took the law into their own hands. They struck down a fellow Christian, dragged an innocent girl from her home, and locked her away like a common criminal." His words cracked like summer lightning through the sanctuary. This was not justice. This was not God's will. This was the act of a mob, and it shames us all. Several townspeople lowered their heads. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The railroad agent sat rigid, his face flushed with anger. Reverend Stone turned toward the back of the church. "Bring her forward," he commanded. The sheriff and his deputy appeared in the doorway, Miriam between them. She looked small and fragile, her plain dress wrinkled from the night in jail. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, yet she held herself with quiet dignity. "Miriam!" Clara's cry split the silence. Before Francis could stop her, she broke free and ran down the center aisle. Miriam knelt as Clara flew into her arms, holding the child close. "God is good," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He has not forsaken us." The congregation watched as Miriam closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. Clara clung to her, tears streaming down her small face. Even the sheriff looked away, discomfort clear in his stance. "Miss Stoltzfus," Reverend Stone called softly, "please come forward." Miriam rose, keeping one arm around Clara as they walked to the front of the church. Francis stepped closer, protectively flanking them both. The preacher's voice rang out clear and strong. "From this day forward, this young woman will no longer be treated as an outcast or fugitive. She has proven her worth through her actions, teaching a child to read, bringing light to a darkened home, showing Christian forbearance in the face of persecution." He turned to face the congregation. "I declare here, before God and this assembly, that Miriam Stoltzfus stands under the protection of this church and this community. Any who would harm her must answer not only to the law, but to their own conscience." The railroad agent shot to his feet, his face mottled with rage. "This changes nothing, Rourke," he spat. "You'll regret choosing a vagrant girl over progress. This isn't over, not by a long shot." He stormed down the aisle, his boots hammering against the floorboards. The door slammed behind him with such force that the windows rattled. A heavy silence followed his departure. Then, slowly, people began to rise from their pews. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, was the first to approach. She pressed Miriam's hand between her own. "My, Tommy's been struggling with his letters," she said softly. Perhaps you might help him too." Miriam's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. Others came forward, first a trickle, then a steady stream. Some offered apologies. Others simply touched her shoulder or murmured words of welcome. Clara beamed up at them all, her small hand firmly clasped in Miriam's. Francis stood back, watching it unfold. The tight band that had constricted his chest for days finally began to loosen. He caught Reverend Stone's eye and nodded his thanks. The sun was setting by the time they finally headed home, their wagon rolling slowly along the snow-packed road. Clara sat between them on the seat, chattering about all that had happened. Miriam listened with a gentle smile, though Francis could see the exhaustion in her face. As they crested the last hill, their cabin came into view. Smoke curled from the chimney. Neighbors had gone ahead to light fires and prepare for their return. The windows glowed with warm lamplight, beckoning them home. Francis drew the wagon to a halt in the yard. Before helping them down, he turned to Miriam. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better," he said gruffly. "Should never have let them take you." Miriam touched his arm lightly. "You did protect me, Francis. You spoke up. You showed them the truth. That took more courage than fighting with fists." Clara scrambled down from the wagon, then reached up to take Miriam's hand. "Come on, I want to show you the new word I practiced while you were gone." Miriam laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to make the gathering dusk a little brighter. Francis watched them climb the porch steps together, silhouetted against the welcoming light from within, his daughter and the gentle teacher who had changed their lives. The cabin door opened wide, spilling warmth and light into the cold evening air. As Francis followed them inside, he sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. The railroad agent's threat still loomed, but that was a fight for another day. For now his family was whole again, and their home was once more filled with the quiet peace that only comes from hearts beating in harmony. The days following Miriam's return brought a profound change to the Rourke homestead. Outside, February winds howled fierce and cold, piling snowdrifts against the cabin walls. But inside, warmth and light seemed to spill from every corner. Francis's bruises slowly faded from purple to yellow, though he still winced when chopping wood or lifting heavy loads. Miriam noticed his discomfort and quietly prepared hot compresses of dried herbs she'd found in the kitchen stores, wrapping them in clean cloth before bed. He accepted her care with gruff thanks, touched by her gentle persistence. Clara flourished under Miriam's renewed teaching. Each morning they sat at the rough-hewn table, sunlight streaming through frosted windows as Clara traced letters in a borrowed slate. Her small fingers grew more confident by the day, and her face lit up whenever she mastered a new word. "Look, Pa," she called one morning, holding up her slate. "I wrote our names, all 3 of them." Francis crossed the room to study her careful printing. Francis, Clara, Miriam. Something caught in his throat at seeing them lined up together, like a proper family. The change in the neighbors was gradual, but unmistakable. First came Mrs. Peterson with a fresh-baked loaf of bread and tearful apologies. Then old Tom Wheeler arrived with a load of split firewood, claiming his arthritis needed the exercise, but looking sheepish as he stacked it by the door. Sarah Jenkins brought her twins, hoping Miriam might help them with their letters too. Soon the cabin rang with children's voices several afternoons a week, as Miriam patiently guided their learning. Francis found himself pausing in his work to listen, remembering how silent the place had been just months ago. One particularly cold afternoon, hoofbeats approached the cabin. Francis tensed, his hand moving toward his rifle, but it was only Reverend Stone driving his sleigh through the snow. He carried a wooden crate filled with books, readers, primers, and even a few adventure tales for Clara. These were gathering dust in the church storage, the preacher explained, stamping snow from his boots. Seems to me they'll do more good here. He turned to Miriam, who stood quietly by the hearth. You're doing the Lord's work, Miss Stoltzfus. Teaching these children, well, it's a blessing to our community. Francis watched carefully, but saw only sincerity in the older man's face. He nodded slowly. We're much obliged, Reverend. Clara, what do you say? Thank you, sir. Clara bounced on her toes, already reaching for a blue-bound volume with gilt edges. The preacher chuckled. Just promise you'll share the stories with your friends, young lady. He declined their invitation to stay for supper, but his visit left a warm glow behind. Evenings became something sacred in the cabin. After the day's work and lessons, they gathered around the crackling fire. Miriam's clear voice would lift in familiar hymns. Amazing grace, be thou my vision, it is well with my soul. Clara quickly learned the words, her sweet child's voice joining in. Francis found himself humming along, then softly singing the old tunes he'd learned at his mother's knee. He hadn't sung since Sarah died, but somehow it felt right now, natural as breathing. The music seemed to fill empty spaces he hadn't known were there. Sometimes they'd spot riders. In the distance, railroad men watching, waiting. Francis kept his rifle clean and close, and made sure the barn door was well barred at night. But he refused to let fear poison these precious evening hours. Pa, Clara said one night as the fire burned low, will you teach Miriam that song Mama used to sing? The one about the wild rose? Francis's hands stilled on the trap he was mending. For a moment, the old grief rose up sharp and bitter. But then he looked at his daughter's hopeful face, at Miriam's gentle presence beside her, and found the pain had softened somehow. Reckon I could, he said roughly. If Miriam wants to learn it. I would be honored, Miriam answered quietly. So Francis taught them Sarah's favorite song, his voice growing stronger with each verse. Clara curled against his side, while Miriam listened intently, her fingers moving as if weaving the melody into memory. Outside, snow fell soft and steady, but the cabin glowed like a lantern in the wilderness, filled with music and the warm light of belonging. They had no way of knowing what challenges the railroad men might bring, or what other storms might gather on the horizon. But in those peaceful evening hours, gathered around the hearth like any other family, it was enough simply to be together, their hearts beating in quiet harmony with the old songs of faith and home. The evening settled softly around the Rourke homestead, bringing with it a hush that seemed almost sacred. Fresh snow had fallen throughout the afternoon, and now the valley lay pristine and white beneath a pearl-gray sky. Inside the cabin, lamplight cast warm shadows on the rough-hewn walls as Francis sat at the kitchen table, papers spread before him. Tom Wheeler, their closest neighbor, had spent hours helping draft these documents. His wife had been a schoolteacher back east, and she knew the proper legal language needed for guardianship papers. The ink bottle sat open, its sharp smell mixing with the sweet scent of pine logs burning in the hearth. Francis drew a deep breath, studying the careful script. The words seemed to dance before his eyes. He'd never been much good at reading, but he recognized the important parts. His name, Miriam's full name, Miriam Ruth Stoltzfus, and the formal language that would make her legally his ward until she came of age. Clara perched on a wooden stool nearby, practically vibrating with excitement. She'd been watching the entire process with bright eyes, understanding that something important was happening. Miriam stood quietly by the fireplace, her hands clasped together, her face a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The scratching of the pen seemed loud in the hushed cabin as Francis carefully signed his name. He'd practiced it dozens of times over the years, making sure he could write it clear and strong. Now those letters meant more than they ever had before. There, he said gruffly, setting down the pen. It's done. Clara slipped down from her stool and padded across the plank floor. Without hesitation, she took Miriam's hand in her small one, looking up at the young woman who had changed their lives so completely. "Teacher," Clara whispered, her voice full of joy. Then, even softer. "Sister?" Miriam's composure broke at that word. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she knelt and gathered Clara into her arms. The little girl hugged her fiercely, as if trying to make up for all the embraces they'd missed before finding each other. Francis watched them, his own eyes growing suspiciously damp. Miriam looked up at him over Clara's shoulder, her face glowing with gratitude and belonging. He managed a smile in return, hoping she could read in it everything he found so hard to say: his thankfulness for her presence, his appreciation for all she'd brought to their home, his relief at finally making official what his heart had known for weeks. Outside, snow continued to fall in lazy spirals, each flake catching the last light of day. The valley was quiet, except for the distant call of an evening bird. Inside, the lamp flickered steadily, casting its gentle light over the three of them, no longer strangers bound by circumstance, but a true family, knit together by choice and love. Francis cleared his throat. "Reckon we ought to give thanks," he said, his voice rough with emotion. It was still new to him, this return to prayer, but it felt right, essential even. They joined hands around the table, Clara's small fingers, Miriam's work-worn ones, his own calloused palm. Francis bowed his head and spoke from his heart. "Lord," he began slowly, "we thank you for your providence, for sending Miriam when we needed her most, for giving us eyes to see past our fears and hearts to welcome what was strange, for making us whole again." He paused, swallowing hard. "For teaching this old mountain man that family ain't just about blood, but about love and trust and your grace." "Amen," Miriam whispered, squeezing Clara's hand. "Amen," Clara echoed brightly. The night drew in around their cabin, stars beginning to peek through breaks in the clouds. But inside, warmth and contentment reigned. The lamp burned steady and true, illuminating the signed papers that made official what they'd all known in their hearts. They belonged together. Three broken pieces made whole by love, faith, and the mysterious workings of God's own hand. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.